It's my pleasure to be here and present. My name is Larson Omberg. I run the Systems Biology Group at Sage Bionetworks. And I must admit, I'm a little depressed, Corey. I've never heard so many negative things put together so quickly. To now talk about the future, let's hope we have some positive things that we can do with this as well. Also, it's my pleasure to be here on the panel together with Ava, Katindi, and Avery. And we're going to talk about the possible futures in knowledge systems. And I think the way we're going to do this, we're running a little bit behind, so we'll do quick introductions. We'll take a few questions from me, and then we'll open up at the end for 1 or 2 questions from the audience. Ava, you want to take it away?
Sure. I am a linguist, and I study language and culture, very much historically, but also in the present time and into the future. And I also run research for the NIH on the All of Us program, really trying to understand complex ideas that have to do with language. So I run UX research, but really I'm trying to understand what trust means and value means when we're looking at having 1 million participants, which is incredibly complicated, but rather fun.
All right. My name is Katindi, Sivi-Njonjo. I come from Kenya. I'm a futurist. So I work a lot in research and policy and engaging government in terms of just understanding how we can make policies better by thinking about the future and then coming back to look at strategy. I'm also a PhD candidate at Regent University in Virginia Beach.
And my name is Avery Sen. I am a policy analyst and strategic planner, and yes, futurist, I admit. Yeah, you may have seen me earlier. I work at SenSound. I also work at SRI International. Yeah, I guess what sums up my expertise is I ask, science and technology, why? Why is it valuable? Why do we use public money to fund it?
So obviously we've been hearing a lot about different challenges facing scientific research, challenges in, I think Laura was the one who mentioned the fact that how do you handle 800,000 papers coming out a year in the peer review process. Most recently hearing the challenges of monopolists taking over the way society is being run. With 2 futurists and someone who spent a lot of time looking at historical facts, how do you see using both our historical knowledge and looking at the future, and what methods do you use in looking towards the future to solve some of these issues? And maybe we can start with just open science, the challenges facing open science.
Shall I go first then?
Please.
So yeah, there's lots of interesting methods in futurism. There's one that I learned not too long ago, which is causal layer analysis. I don't know if you all are familiar with that. CLA for short. And I think it's helpful for understanding open science because basically it says, okay, there's causes and effects in the world. How is it that we're supposed to make sense of these things? But it does so in a layered way. And sort of the very superficial layer, there's the litany, right? There's the facts. One level down is all of the models for how the universe works, and that's what scientists tell us for, this model tells us that the climate is going to go this way or the economy is going to go that way. Underneath that is all of the just more deeper worldview, like, I'm a Democrat and you're a Republican or whatever, that kind of thing. But even deeper still is the myths and that we use. So, the lone scientist in a garage inventing something is the way that science happens. And I think that whether you're thinking about the past or the future, and especially for science, because it deals with facts and models and things like that, it's helpful to understand that everything that we think about, every kind of cause and effect relationship has these different levels to it. And very often in science, because we're very sort of, objectivist, well, at least physical scientists are, we tend to only deal with those 2 first superficial levels. We don't get deeper into it, and I try to think deeper.
I think for me, as a futurist, I see, and also being outside science, it's very interesting to just listen into the conversations that are going on. And one of the things that struck me is that as scientists, my sense, or the sense I get, is that as you analyze, you look at the future in sort of like, it's almost like you have one official future after you do the research and after you hypothesize. But in my world, we say that there's no one official future, because as you analyze and as you think about what's going on, and as you look at the different things that are going on in the system, you realize that anything could happen that could shift what we thought would be the official future. And so one of the things that I think is an interesting way to look at the future is to ask, what are the things that are going on within us that could alter the way we look at things and, in a sense, present different challenges or different futures that we might have to face, whether we like it or not. So that's one of the interesting things that I sort of like see here. The other one is, of course, that then brings a lot of disruptions, particularly around how traditional systems work. So the sense I get is that in your community, there's a certain way of doing things, there's a methodology of doing things. But the world is sort of like, in my world, we say that it's a VUCA world. It's volatile, it's very complex, it's ambiguous, you know, and so how do you handle the disruptions that come with, and somehow that you hadn't anticipated before? So I think about, for example, the banking system and the mobile technology that in my country now, really the mobile banking technology is the norm. And a while back, we had like only 20% of the population banked, and nobody thought that the banking system would ever be replaced by anything. But this technology comes and completely takes over, and banks are now fumbling. So how do you handle such disruptions? And how does the science world handle that? Then the other one is, I think, the assumptions we keep making about how the world works. And I think that's an interesting way of looking at it as well as issues around unintended consequences. So sometimes we might prescribe something as how we see it working, but because we hadn't factored in all these other things that could be happening, sometimes we get unintended consequences of the results we see in the future. So that's my take.
Can I ask a follow-up before I give David? How do you guard yourself against those unintended consequences? Is there anything you can do as looking into the future that would help you to prepare you for those unintended consequences? Because I think that's in general what we constantly see, right?
Yeah.
Supporting a merging of companies, for example, eventually leads to monopolism. You might not have thought about that when you started out in the process. Yeah.
So I think one of the things that I say is that we constantly monitor trends. But again, I think the mistake a lot of people make, particularly if you work within certain silos, is that you're constantly monitoring the trends in your area, and you're not monitoring things around you that, in a sense, affect the things that you do in your area. So monitoring trends is one of them that is very critical. But the other one is being versatile, because I think as people who are committed to the professions that we are in, we have a love affair with our professions. And sometimes it's very difficult to see perspectives from other people. And so in futures thinking, what we insist on is, and I was just laughing at lunchtime because we were talking about open systems, and I didn't realize that we were actually we didn't mean the same thing. So in science, I get that open systems means open data, like it's just data. But if I look at this room, I really see just scientists, but how else do you incorporate other people to come into the room, like artists, markets, people who do, marketing and other people? Because it is incorporating other people into the room that you're able to get those different perspectives and then be able to see the issue that you're talking about from very different perspectives, and then be able to be a bit more prepared about those unintended consequences or the futures that might be presented. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
From my perspective, because I study language and culture, and I am not a futurist, one of the most important things is to realize that most of the language that we use is a cultural construct. So we don't necessarily have shared meaning, and even though there's a group of people who may work in the same field sitting in a room, you might define science one way and somebody else might define it differently. And being able to look historically at what was science 20 years ago or 50 years ago is very meaningful to understand how we are perceiving what falls within the realm of science today. And it's particularly working on a program that has to do with health, there's not a lot of shared understanding. So doing a lot of field work to ask people, what does health mean to you? What does it mean to get data back? What's value to you? What kind of information do you want? And listening to the panel that was a bit earlier, one of the things that really struck me is how much we don't ever talk about metaphor, because we've created this model in which your body and your data are not the same thing. So there's a split between two objects, and you don't necessarily own your data because it's kind of unclear who owns your data, even though we argue about it, but we've built a transactional metaphor into the system. So there's an idea that there's monetary value. Just by using the word value, you make it a financial system. And all of this underlays the assumptions that we're making. And if we don't start to make those explicit, it's really hard to understand what we're actually talking about and then to look at policy or anything that we're trying to talk about. If we don't have a shared understanding of the words, and just to give a second example, I work on genomics a fair amount, and the way that a scientist talks about genomics and the way that someone who might receive their information back understands it is incredibly different. But there's the time factor to any longitudinal study as well, which is today, I'm fine, tell me everything. But tomorrow, somebody made this comment earlier, I'm pregnant. I don't want to know anything about what my genome says. I just want everything to be fine. And that we forget often to model time into language and culture to try and understand these very complex systems of meaning. And that's what I work on.
So Avery, during your talk at lunch, you talked about the two different modes of thinking, or your wife talked about the two different modes of thinking. I think you called it, she called it, or you called it penal and vaginal. The question I have with that is, how do you interact between those two modes of thinking? So. Can you tell me about the birds and the bees? I'm sorry. What I meant to say was, there seems to be as a scientist, I obviously have one way that I tend to think and the way I've been trained to think about it. And what is the best way of getting those two to interact? I think, Ava, you also have some experience with this because you think of it as more in the mode 2 versus mode 1. What's the best way to get these things to work together? I think, Cora, you mentioned the fact that the way thing that scientists work, the one thing is that you have the ability of determining truth versus non-truth, or what's, yeah.
That's a good question. I don't know. Let me see if I get to figure out how while I'm talking. But, I think they're both, I don't want to say that one is bad and one is good. They're both, differently suited to different situations. I think if there is, I'll use, lowercase p, political agreement about what the problem is and how to, then mode 1 works very well. Or, in fact, we were also talking at lunch difference between physics and biology. And, in physics, things tend to be simple. And in biology, they're very complex. So yeah, mode 2, when there are different communities, people who aren't invited to the table necessarily, that's when mode 2 I think works better. I think I'll punt on whether or not they can work together.
I think just being able to be aware that there's more than one way of thinking or one mode of thinking is important. That breaking out of everyone being in the same place and from the same background. In Kara's talk, even just thinking about all of these issues as it moves across languages and cultures, pretty monoculture here, and we're talking about English, and when you're talking about the ways in which ideas change, metaphors across languages, it's just, there's so much diversity in the worldview that we don't necessarily bring in, so even just having these two options, at the very least, as ways of thinking is very useful as a starting place even.
Yeah. Actually, this brings me back to Eric's talk as well, right? I mean, he talked about the diversity between a medical institution such as Mount Sinai or Stanford versus a regional hospital. I mean, how does that relate when you go to another country, for example? I don't know if, Katindi, if you can comment on that.
Maybe not.
Maybe not?
Yeah, I can't think of any ideas right now. Yeah.
Anyone else want to comment on that? Because in the situation where you have variations, so like resources, for example, how do you integrate with a larger group of people where you have diversity, for example, in resources? How do you include in a research project, for example, once data becomes open, how would you include a citizen scientists or scientists from another country where they might not have the computational resources that are available?
Oh, okay. I think I can go. I think one of the things that I find very interesting is the fact that when these relationships, maybe between, let's say, a scientist from here and a scientist maybe from where I come from, is that there is, from the beginning, an inequality in the relationship. And that really affects the quality of outcome, because I think there's a top-down approach that is usually sort of like at the beginning. And my sense is that I think one of the things that I find people struggling a lot is the fact that there's a constant question about whose knowledge is it. There's a question about what knowledge in the first place. There's a question about for what purpose. And unless we are able to be clear and have a mutual understanding about those answers to those questions, I think there's a problem from the beginning. But then I think the second thing is that, so when we talk about collaboration, there has to be that, the humility, I think, to learn from each other and to have an understanding that you're not coming into a vacuum, that there's something that these people have been doing things a certain way, they have answers, perhaps, to their problems. Probably they may not have sophisticated tools to solve those problems. So the question becomes, how do we come together with the intention of mutual learning? How do we come together with the intention of, in a sense, a mutual respect and a sense of equality, that each of us has something to bring on the table? And I think that is what would make a successful collaboration and successful, if you may, a relationship that can lead to results. Yep.
I think too, if we think about historically, 50 years ago, you'd go to the doctor and your doctor would tell you what's wrong with you and you would do it. No internet, you wouldn't Google it, you'd just trust your doctor to have done it. So when we reach a world where so much has changed about what we can individually understand, and it also goes to Corey's talk about how much information you can gather that may not be true. And so we don't really understand that, but even in a very short period of time, the way that we understand what science is, or that we have some type of autonomy, that we can get our own data and then make our own decisions, is so incredibly different that trying to figure out how we model a world in which we have to do that. I mean, you know, I've done a fair amount of research on cancer, and some people just want the doctor to tell them what to do. Some of them want the studies to prove that's the right treatment, and understanding all of the different ways in which people want to engage with data is another very complicated way of understanding the future, because it's not all the same, and we have so much more information. Whether or not it's true or valid is a whole other world. We'll let Corey enjoy that one. But it's just another very difficult thing about trying to imagine futures. And one of the things that what Katindi was saying that made me think is, when you're thinking about the future, 50 years ago, would anybody have thought that we would all look up on Facebook whether or not we should take a particular drug? So when we're trying to think out about possible futures, it's very hard as things change so quickly and as there's so much information that passes around the world. Another thing that struck me about Eric's talk was the binary between being sick and healthy, which is a particular worldview, but isn't everybody's worldview. And what happens if we envision a future where it is more blurred over time, and so trying to find ways to model this and then create experiences that align to people's different views is incredibly complicated, but probably what we need to be doing, and really pushing the boundaries of, if we want the world to be a better place, how do we envision futures that give people more, a better life, more respect, all the different things that come up when you do this kind of research, what people want. And I think that trying to expand the possibilities is something that we shall put our creativity to try and envision other worlds.
Yeah, I mean, I see also what you mentioned is the idea that, getting the data is not enough for someone to make a decision, right? You need that interpretation of some sort.
Context.
Context, yeah.
And I think the methods of futuring themselves are a way to get people from diverse communities to start talking about applications or about answers to problems. When I work with executives or whatever, the present is too contentious. Right, what happens today, there's a lot of disagreement about. But if you just shift, you could take the same issue, but you shift it out 30 years, it doesn't, it's not the person's job on the line. It becomes easier, a safer space to talk about the same issues.
30 years sounds like a very long time, considering how fast things are moving now.
I guess so, yeah, I guess so. But 5 years, 10 years, 100 years, whatever the right number is for the group that you're with. And you kind of have to figure that out. Also, if you want people to think about 30 years, you have to ask them to think about 50 years. If you want people to think about 10 years, you have to ask them to think about 20 years. Because people will revert to what they know,
And if you're trying to affect policy, that's got a really long time to try and affect policy to make change, if that's where the work that you're thinking of is going. That takes forever.
Yeah, but and the thing about futuring that is very interesting is that you allow people to, like he says, move away from themselves and begin to sort of concentrate on the issue and try and begin to make connections about the things that could happen. And because of that, people are more open to being honest about what the issues are and how to resolve the issues, much more than when they are in the story and they have self-interests or they have vested ideas about what is right and what is wrong. So I think futuring is an interesting way of getting people to discuss honestly about what could be. And then the interesting thing about futuring is also that, yes, it looks abstract, but you can bring it back to the present and ask ourselves, what must we do now to, in a sense, create the future that we would like to see and avert what we don't want to see? But then whose definition would that be? And because then you have different people in the room, everybody is able to present their interests, and in a sense, you're able to get a common ground. Yeah.
So diversity again.
Yeah.
Making sure that we combine what the scientist wants and what the actual patient wants and what the...
And also, something that Katindi alluded to earlier, which I don't think we really hammered on, it's the diversity of the input. But there's an S at the end of future, right? Futures, right? We don't, it's anticipatory, it's not predictive. We're not trying to say this is the way the future is going to be, right? Creating alternate scenarios for the way things work is also giving the folks that are participating in it a diversity of different options, different, settings in which to play out their actions.
And I think you have to play out the negatives as well as the positives. I think sometimes there's this idea that we're dreaming up all the good futures to figure out, but if you don't dream up all the bad ones as well, you can't look for ways to avoid them.
Yeah.
It's as much as part of it.
Katindi, you had an example with 5 alternative futures, and I believe you had written about 5 different...
Well, yeah, so sometime, I think early 2000, I was involved in a project that was thinking about the future of Kenya. And at that time, we had had a president for 24 years. And one of the things, it was reasonable at that time to begin talking about an alternative president. And so a group of people came together and were discussing what might the future of Kenya look like with or without this particular person. And one of the scenarios was around the fact that Kenya had actually all the ingredients of having a civil conflict. A second scenario was around politics and how just trying to get a common understanding about how our constitution is maybe constituted and how just trying to get those political agreements was going to be very difficult. And in a sense, it was going to heighten a lot of tensions. And a third scenario was around economic growth and how that would be good for the country, but in actual sense, if doing the analysis would, the data was showing that it would maybe cause a lot of inequalities in the country. And the fourth scenario, which was in a sense forced on us, was a scenario that was thinking about how do we try and do everything concurrently to have a prosperous country. And so I was in charge of sort of like disseminating that information throughout the country. And in around 7 years, 3 of the 4 scenarios had actually happened. So the first one is we had a constitution, no, we had an election, and that current president was kicked out. And we had the next president who took over was an economist, and of course he took us down the economics path. And for sure, the country was, the economy was growing, but the inequalities were really deepening as well. Then we tried to amend the constitution, and there was a crisis, and the political tensions heightened, and in 2007 we had a disputed election, and everything just went haywire, and the country was literally falling apart. And so scenarios became one of those things that people reference as a group of people that sat down to predict, but we insist that we were not predicting. We were just taking obvious signs that were there, trying to make sense of them and trying to ask ourselves, what could we do? And so one of the things that is now conscious among people is that we need to constantly try and ask ourselves, so that we are not caught flat-footed, what can we do beforehand to try and make sure that we think through these things way before they happen. And so our experience has been that discussing perspectives from the future is actually quite interesting. And sometimes it's very disarming because you'll have to have very uncomfortable discussions about, perhaps if, let's say I'm sitting here and I'm saying, science is not going to be relevant in the future, and you have invested, let's say, 30 years of your life doing that. It's not information you want to deal with, but perhaps it's interesting because then you may want to start asking yourself, how do you make it relevant in the future so that it doesn't have to go away? And so it forces you to have those meaningful conversations about the future.
We've definitely been challenged today. I think I would like to hand it off if there are any questions in the audience.
Same rules as Corey.
Yeah. There's a question right there.
Hi, Vitaly Justinovich from Northwestern University. Katindi and Avery, you spoke about the future and you spoke about the present. I'm curious how much history plays a role in your thinking about the future. Like today we spoke a lot about the explosion of information and data and how unusual it is for everyone to have access to so much information. Arguably a parallel event in the past was the invention of the printing press that then led to one of the most murderous conflicts in European history, the 30-year war. So how much history plays, what kind of role does history play in your thinking?
All right. In foresight, we normally say that history does not necessarily continue in the future. So, and that doesn't negate the fact that history informs the present and it affects the future. So in a sense, what we are doing today is making future history. But I think the caution that we have as futurists is that sometimes, and this is particularly around predictions or modeling, is the fact that if you always assume that the past will always continue in the future, you introduce blind spots into your hypothesis, if you may, in the sense that if there are new things, what we call weak signals that are happening around us that we are not aware of, then you immediately, because of projecting from the past to the future, you immediately introduce an error to the hypothesis. And so it's important, yes, as you acknowledge that the past may inform the future, it's also important to ask yourself what else is going on around us that may alter those patterns that we are seeing that are emanating from the past to the future. I don't know whether that is clear. Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. I agree wholeheartedly. I think there's a difference between being informed by how things happened in history and extrapolating trends from history. So first of all, yeah, of course, like I think that the longer you're trying to think about the future, you need to think about the past to prepare to create whatever scenarios or do whatever foresight work you're going to be doing. But yeah, we have to acknowledge, like, we don't have knowledge about the future, right? The future is only fiction, right? We only have knowledge about the past, so we can only be informed by it. But it shouldn't, like I said, shouldn't be just extrapolation. Mm-hmm. We can understand, different forms of causal mechanisms and how they interacted with each other as ways to think about how to construct a fiction that might inform our decisions.
So as you, I'm Dan Atkins from the University of Michigan. As you imagine possible knowledge futures, the focus has been largely on knowledge environments for the creation of knowledge, research, discovery. But I'm wondering what your thoughts are about the impact of these future environments on the process of learning, including even in the K-12 settings. It seems to me we need to aspire to have dual use, and that these two things should be tightly connected. I'd like to hear some of your thoughts about that.
Anyone feel?
I'm not sure I understood the question.
So the idea of the interaction between the dual uses and education for resources that are being developed, knowledge resources that are being developed.
So whose knowledge? Again, I think is it the average citizen's knowledge? Is it trying to think about the specialist's knowledge? Is it the knowledge that's going to be embedded in some AI? All of these, I think, are very, so yes, and we need to think about all the multitude of different types of knowledge. And depending on the question that you're asking, which I think another point that we didn't emphasize is that, we could think about the future, but that doesn't help. You need to have a question in mind, a particular focus of decision that you have in mind. And then you could try to figure out, okay, well, what types of knowledge and whose knowledge? And then, what are the modes of developing that knowledge in one way or another? Sorry, that's a general answer.
Yeah, I think one of the things that my work has, in a sense, I have come to make peace with is that sometimes when you approach the idea of knowledge from an expert's perspective, it's very easy to miss out on a lot of the lessons that you can learn from people who just experience life, and combining those two, expertise, the theories and everything, but also combining that with experience and just people sharing their lives is absolutely very important in terms of being able to then discuss what the future of knowledge will be. And I think the sense I get is that nobody has a monopoly of knowledge, and that is very critical in discussing the future. And unless we approach futures thinking from the point of view that it's a collective more than an expert point of view, the more accurate we tend to be about the future.
Yeah, from a mode 2 perspective, I would say, it's just to resonate with that, it's as important to think about knowledge stocks as knowledge flows.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It's not just what knowledge is created, it's how is it moving, who has it, who's giving it to who else.
Okay. I think we thank the panel.